Former cult members or friends of cult members of Reddit, what is your creepiest, scariest, or most disturbing story, and is that what made you leave? My parents were members of a so-called Islamic cult, not a real religious group, but a circle led by a fake holy man pretending to be divine. He'd lead chanting sessions and claim to channel spiritual power. One night, during a dimly lit gathering, everyone had their eyes closed in deep chanting. I opened mine and caught him staring right at me. He realized I was quietly laughing at how absurd the whole thing was. From that moment, he decided I was a threat. He began turning my parents against me. He told them he could see the future, that I would someday break their hearts and destroy our family. They believed him. From that day on, 13-year-old me became an outcast in my own home. Then, he shifted all his attention to my older brother. Suddenly, my brother was showered with expensive gifts, designer watches, a new Jeep, VIP tickets, while I was treated like a curse. But it didn't stop there. He convinced people I was mentally unstable, that I needed to be isolated. For years, I came home to an empty house, cut off from everyone. The rumor spread through the community until people just accepted it as fact. Even today, it still haunts my reputation. Later, that man drained my parents' savings, promising spiritual blessings in return. Through a strange twist of fate, I ended up taking care of my 2-year-old cousin, and then he spread another lie, claiming I was a danger to her. My parents believed him again. They treated his sons as their own, and saw me as their enemy. To this day, I've never had a real conversation with either of them. I've worked for years, they don't know what I do, who I work with, or even where my office is. The only thing they ever ask about is payday. There's so much more that I can't fit here. But I will say this, I am stronger than anyone ever gave me credit for. That man, that fraud, is gone now, and I forgive my parents. Not because they deserve it, but because I refuse to carry their pain anymore. If all that couldn't break me back then, what could possibly break me now? The most disturbing thing about that cult wasn't just the man himself, it's that there are many like him out there. People who pretend to be divine, gaining followers through manipulation, fear, and fake miracles. If anyone listening has gone through something like this, please know your family's sickness is not your fault. Be kind, be strong, and most of all, be better than them. Peace. Story 2. One morning, the day of another cult meeting, my mother came into my room to wake me up. I didn't want to go. I'd barely slept the night before and I wasn't feeling well. I just wanted to stay home and rest. But she insisted. After a few minutes of trying to get me ready, forcing me into the same stiff, uncomfortable clothes we always had to wear, she suddenly lost her patience. She shouted, grabbed me, and pushed me off the bed. I sat there, stunned and hurt, while she yelled that I'd be punished for rebelling. Then she stormed out, leaving me behind. That moment changed everything for me. I'd been thinking about leaving for a while, but that morning made the decision clear. I was done, not just with her control, but with the cult itself. Later, she tried to fix me by taking me to therapy, hoping someone would convince me to return. She cried to the therapist about how there was something wrong with her daughter. But the therapist saw through it. They told her to stop forcing me to attend, and, for once, she listened, though she never stopped mourning the fact that I didn't believe anymore. That was about 7 years ago, and I still remember it vividly. It wasn't an easy experience, but in a strange way, I'm grateful for it. It opened my eyes. It taught me that freedom, real freedom, is worth standing up for, no matter who you have to face. Story 3. A friend of mine accidentally got involved with a cult in Iowa. At first, he thought it was just a really close-knit church. Friendly people, strong community, the kind of place that makes you feel welcomed right away. But over time, little things started to feel off. The rules got stricter, the expectations heavier, and he began to realize something wasn't right. Eventually, he snapped out of it and decided to leave. Not long after, he got a job opportunity in Texas and moved there, hoping to start fresh and put it all behind him. About a week after settling in, there was a knock at his door. When he opened it, standing there was one of the cult members, a woman who had driven all the way from Iowa to bring him back. She started out calm, pleading with him to return, but as he refused, she became more and more emotional, her behavior growing increasingly erratic. In the end, things got so intense that he had to call the police to have her removed from the property. Story 4. Yes, I've been part of a cult. I may as well tell you the story from the top. Picture this: you're 18. Just finishing your A-levels, looking forward to life finally beginning. Like a lot of idealistic young people, I had this notion that I wanted to go abroad and do good. development work, charity projects, that sort of thing. I found an organization through a newspaper advert, signed up at a recruitment weekend in Hull, and, straight after my last exam, jetted off to Denmark for 6 months of training. The plan was simple. I'd train there, then head to Africa to build toilets, teach about AIDS prevention, and generally help people. You get the idea. The first problem came the moment I arrived, because they forgot I was coming. I sat in the airport for 3 hours before finally thinking, sod this, and taking a taxi to the school, making sure to charge it to them. A month later, we were all put to work cleaning up the training school. My friend and I were assigned to tidy the library. While shelving books, I came across one called The History of North Korea. I flipped through it, laughed at the weak propaganda, and tossed it out without thinking much of it. Then there was the time they held a sing-along session. Fine, whatever, except my friends and I didn't feel like going. We were teenagers. We'd rather do nothing. A teacher stormed into our room, ordered us out, and was clearly taken aback when I refused. She didn't quite know how to handle a grumpy English teenager who'd run out of patience for nonsense. The real turning point came when I stumbled across a website called Tvnd Alert. It still exists, I think. It detailed all sorts of accusations about the charity I'd joined: police raids, money laundering, tax evasion, false accounting, brainwashing, even gun running, not to mention wage slavery and horrendous working conditions. I forwarded the link to my dad, who happened to be a journalist, and asked if it was real. He wrote back, "It's real. Get out of there." Well, that certainly got my attention. I started emailing the website's creator to figure out how to leave quietly. Unfortunately, my private email was published on the site, which my employers were monitoring. The timing couldn't have been worse. We were about to leave for an outdoor weekend when I was suddenly pulled off the bus. They took me to an office and left me alone with a very large, very angry Danish man named René. He tried to intimidate me for about an hour, but I wasn't scared. It might have had something to do with the lock knife in my pocket, just in case. Eventually, he gave up and told me to leave. I got on MSN and messaged my mom, who promptly called René herself. She told him, in no uncertain terms, that if he didn't pay for a flight home immediately, she'd fly over with a press pack and make his life very difficult. Amazingly, it worked. They bought me a ticket home on the condition that I wouldn't talk to the media. Naturally, I broke that promise the very next day. As a postscript, the cult's leader eventually went on trial. The school where I'd been stationed closed down, and the organization itself has since collapsed spectacularly. And that's the story of how, at 18, I managed to escape and help expose a Danish cult. Story 5. A few years ago, I became close friends with an Olympic athlete, someone who was deeply involved in a well-known Hollywood religious organization. Because of his semi-fame, he received VIP treatment at their celebrity center, and I often tagged along. It was surreal. The lobby was full of recognizable faces from film and music, and once I even got a warm hug from a major Hollywood actor you'd definitely know. My friend eventually convinced me to quit my day job and work as his assistant. We traveled, went to events, partied, trained together. It was exciting, strange, and intense all at once. Meanwhile, his church's publicity team tried to set him up with various women from their community, but nothing seemed to work out. Late at night, we'd have long philosophical talks. Some ideas sounded wise at first, but the constant push for money and spiritual levels made me skeptical. Then one night he made a cruel, dismissive comment about gay people. It shifted something for me. I began to see how judgment and fear often hid behind their talk of enlightenment. Not long after, he started crossing boundaries, asking for massages after workouts, then making increasingly inappropriate requests. That was my breaking point. By then, he also owed me months of pay and was sinking into debt from his church courses, so I packed up and left. We never spoke again. Looking back, I realize I got closer to that world than almost any outsider ever does, and what I saw taught me that even the most glamorous organizations can hide deep manipulation behind charm, fame, and spiritual branding. If you ever find yourself around something that feels off, trust your instincts. No belief system or celebrity connection is worth losing your boundaries for. Story 6. Two of my best friends are former members of a high-control religious group, and one of my old childhood friends is still in it. One of my friends told me that their older sibling was abused by members of the congregation. When they tried to report it to the elders, it was allegedly brushed aside. Not long after, his entire family was disfellowshipped, excommunicated, which meant they could no longer speak to certain relatives who stayed in the group. Something similar happened to my other friend, though not quite as severe. My former best friend and I were inseparable growing up, but when I moved abroad for 3 years, everything changed. When I came back, he barely spoke to me. It was like he'd built a wall around himself. The hardest part came recently. I was at a grocery store with one of my ex-JW friends, someone who was never baptized, so he can still technically talk to members. We bumped into my old friend's mother. They started chatting, and I was standing right there beside him, but she didn't even look at me, not a glance. It was like I didn't exist. Apparently, she even avoids my mom when they cross paths. I guess she knows there's no chance of bringing us back, so in her mind, we're already gone. My old friend has always been brilliant, one of the smartest people I've ever known, but he's been sheltered his whole life. His world is controlled by doctrine, where he can go, who he can talk to, even what kind of education he's allowed to have. And it's heartbreaking, because I can still see the person he used to be, and all the potential that's been locked away by fear, obedience, and control. If you've ever lost someone to a belief system like that, you know the grief. They are still alive, but you can reach them. All you can do is hope that one day they'll see the world waiting for them on the outside. Story 7. Not exactly a cult per se, but it gives you a good idea of just how influential religion can be, even over rational, intelligent people. My parents were deeply involved in our Christian church throughout my entire childhood. We're talking about attending services 3 or 4 times a week, donating large portions of their income, volunteering for everything. If you remember the church scene in Borat, that was my church, but times 10. Don't get me wrong, the church did some genuine good for the community, but there was a sinister layer of indoctrination beneath the surface. When I was 15, my parents found out I was gay, long story, and they didn't take it well. Their first response was to turn to the church for guidance. Following the church's advice, they basically shunned me in my own home. I wasn't spoken to, wasn't acknowledged, and was grounded from every privilege imaginable. The only way to earn my way back into the family was to seek help, either from a Christian psychiatrist or from the church elders. I chose the psychiatrist. The man I met was an ex-gay Christian therapist. One thing he said has stayed with me all these years: I get it. Turning away from a sinful homosexual lifestyle is difficult. I did. I've been married to my beautiful wife for 6 years and have 2 beautiful daughters. Sometimes, though, I still meet men from the internet for sex, and then I ask for God's forgiveness. Needless to say, his version of help didn't help much, no pun intended. My parents' faith started costing them their friendships. Their closest friends at church told them they needed to do whatever it took to purge me of my choice. Around the same time, my older brother got a tattoo, which caused another uproar. On top of that, we were forced to attend summer sleepaway camps. Think Jesus Camp Light, where they tried to make us wear hoodies that said things like abortion is homicide and homosexuality is an abomination. Our refusal to comply wasn't received well. Eventually, all of this became too much. The church turned on my parents, making them feel guilty, ashamed, and like they'd failed both God and their children. They were quietly shunned, just as they had once been told to shun me. That was years ago. Things are different now. My parents and I have a much better relationship, and they've long since left that church behind. But it still shakes me to think about how powerful religion can be, how it can twist logic, divide families, and turn love into punishment. It's both sad and sickening how easily rational minds can be controlled by fear wrapped in faith. Story 8. Former member here. For about a year, I was part of what called itself a Christian discipleship program. But in reality, it was a tightly controlled system that used faith as a weapon. Every mistake, every sin, had to be paid for through physical punishment. Push-ups, laps, whatever they could invent to discipline the body, and, supposedly, the soul. During my time there, I became close friends with another member, a guy who smoked constantly. About 7 months in, he got caught sneaking a cigarette behind one of the dorms. Think he committed a serious crime. They woke him up at 5 in the morning and forced him to run. Later that same day, one of the leaders drove him to an abandoned prison outside town and made him run laps around it, 6, maybe 8 miles in total. All that, just because he smoked one cigarette. It wasn't even the worst thing that happened there. But it summed up the whole mentality. Everything was about control. Break the body to save the soul. Crush individuality to prove obedience. Looking back, I realize how normalized that kind of treatment had become. It was instead about faith, it was about fear. Funny side note, I told my friend, the same one who got punished, about this story being shared online. He ended up posting his own version too, confirming it all. Reading his post brought it all rushing back and reminded me how far we've both come since escaping that place. If anyone watching this is in a program or ministry that controls your body, your mind, or your choices, that's not faith. That sips domination dressed as devotion. You deserve freedom. Story 9. I used to be part of what called itself a discipleship program, a Pentecostal reformative center in rural Arkansas. On paper, it sounded like a place for spiritual renewal. In reality, it was a high-control environment that used faith as a leash. The minimum stay was 13 months. I lived in the women's dorm with about 35 other students. Every morning began the same way. At 5:30 a.m., the lights came on, and we shuffled down to the basement to pray. We knelt in front of folding chairs and prayed out loud for a full hour while leaders paced behind us. If your voice faded, if you paused too long, or if you nodded off, you were punished. Afterward came breakfast, a reading from Proverbs, and chores until 9:30. Then we were divided between class and the shop. In class, we studied scripture and learned to apply biblical principles to our daily walk. The shop was more physical. We built crosses, plaques, and small crafts to sell outside big box stores. The ministry called the program free, but we funded it ourselves by standing outside Walmarts asking for donations. We were the labor force and the income source, all in one. When work ended in the evening, we had dinner, showers, a short service, and lights out by 10 p.m. There was no personal time. You were never alone except in the bathroom or the shower. We could call family only once a week, 10 minutes, on speakerphone, with a leader listening. If you said anything unwholesome, the call ended instantly, and sometimes you lost the privilege for months. Letters were censored, visitors were rare. Breaking a rule meant being placed on discipline. That could last from 2 weeks to 3 months. During discipline, you ate last, getting whatever was left. You lost all contact with family, worked the longest hours, memorized extra verses, and were constantly watched. The shop had no running water or toilet, just a bucket. You were told the exhaustion purified you. Medicine and doctors were forbidden. Illness meant you'd allowed the devil into your body. The cure was prayer. I arrived on March 10th, 2009. 19 years old, from a non-Pentecostal background, naive and hopeful. After 4 months of near-constant discipline, I broke down and decided to comply. The alternative was endless punishment. Once I surrendered, life got easier. Not better, just smoother. I was a good fundraiser. Most weekends I brought in close to $1,000. Money talked. The leaders claimed not to show favoritism, but anyone who produced income or looked presentable suddenly became the poster child of God's work. They took me to churches and sponsorship events, parading me as an example of divine transformation. Pastors would beam from the pulpit, "Look what God's love can do." It felt fake, but I smiled anyway. Obedience kept you safe. The ministry later decided to open a diner to raise more money. They hired a new cook, a young man I'll call Jay, because he'd once worked in prison kitchens. Only the good students were allowed to help at the diner. There were 7 of us. At first, we loved the assignment. We weren't usually allowed around men, and Jay was charismatic, but his attention turned quickly from friendly to invasive. He teased, flirted, brushed against us when no one was looking. Some girls played along, others froze. I tried to ignore him. He noticed. It started small, a cornered conversation. A hand on my shoulder held too long, then escalated. One afternoon, he trapped me in the walk-in cooler. I fought back, praying out loud, "God, please, please help me." At that exact moment, another girl walked in. Jay jumped away, yanked up his pants, and bolted, shouting down the hall, "I caught Emily with a phone." He turned his crime into my punishment. Leaders dragged me to the office. I showed them the bruises on my arms and back. They accused me of lying to escape discipline. Jay said I'd been trying to call a boyfriend. I didn't even have one. No one believed me. The other girls stayed silent. Fear kept them quiet. I was placed on discipline for 2 months, the longest anyone had heard of. Jay asked that I keep working at the diner because she's good in the kitchen, and they agreed. After that, he changed tactics. Maybe guilt, maybe power. He started apologizing, telling me he loved me, that God had brought us together. It made me sick, but I nodded and stayed small. Resistance only brought punishment. A few girls eventually left the program and reported him for assault. Their complaints were dismissed as spiritual rebellion. The local sheriff's wife worked for the ministry. She told the sheriff we made up stories to avoid discipline. There was nowhere to turn. I was trapped. 500 miles from home, no money, no phone, no allies. Each day felt endless. Then, unexpectedly, a new girl arrived. Her parents were major donors. They gave the ministry close to $100,000 every year. She was immediately granted privileges the rest of us couldn't dream of. When Jay targeted her, she threatened to tell her parents. Suddenly, the leadership cared. Jay was fired. The diner shut down within a week. For the first time in months, I could breathe. A few months later, the ministry announced plans to open a new center in my hometown. Because I was considered a model graduate, they transferred me there. The new directors, a pastor and his wife, were kind, genuine people. Under them, the program finally resembled actual faith. No more punishments, no screaming, no fear. I could heal. I graduated after 14 months in 2011. Stepping into the real world felt strange, quiet, unsupervised, free. Not long after, I met the man who became my husband. Today, we have a baby boy. The trauma still echoes, but it no longer defines me. People sometimes ask whether I'd erase those 13 months if I could. Part of me wants to spare the younger version of myself the terror, but another part knows that surviving it made me who I am. It taught me to question authority, to trust my instincts, and to recognize manipulation hiding behind holy words. Every morning, I wake up with gratitude simply because I can. Because I'm no longer being told when to pray, when to eat, or when to sleep. Because my faith, whatever shape it takes now, is mine. That sips what freedom feels like. Story 10. I don't know if it technically qualified as a cult, but I grew up in a church group that was pretty close, if not outright there. My creepiest story is this. A big church, which basically controlled by fear a network of smaller ones, ran its own college, an unaccredited so-called Bible college meant for kids from those churches, so we wouldn't have to go to secular schools, which they considered the devil's playground. The pastor of that main church was treated almost like a god. Everyone adored him, hung on his every word, and let him dictate their lives. Since my family was deep in the group, there wasn't really any other acceptable option but for me to attend that college. Between my freshman and sophomore year there, everything imploded. That pastor, the one who was practically worshipped, was convicted of SA. He was counseling and for taking her across state lines. He ended up being sentenced to 12 years in prison. Here's the part that still makes my skin crawl. I know for a fact that this man had keys to every single door on campus. He was known for making surprise visits to the girls' dormitories, completely unannounced. That means a convicted predator had a key to my room, and nobody ever questioned it. No one even dared. My family had already been quietly distancing themselves from the church, but this was the breaking point, the final straw that pushed us out for good. Story 11. When I was a freshman in college, one of my roommates, my best friend since 3rd grade, started going to a campus church group called Standing in the Gap, a branch of Young Life. At the time, I was fairly religious myself, coming from an RLDS background, so I figured I'd tag along one night to see what he was so excited about. We went in, and it was your typical Bible group for young people. They started with prayers, hands raised high in the air, then moved into praise and worship songs with a live band. The praise leader gave a message. They passed around a collection plate and wrapped up with more songs and prayers. Pretty innocent stuff, for the most part. The hand-raising threw me a little, but I brushed it off. Some churches just get enthusiastic. I started going regularly, rarely missing a meeting. When I did miss a night for homework or studying, without fail I'd get a call or visit afterward asking where I was and saying they'd missed me. It was a bit weird, but everyone was friendly enough, so I ignored the red flags. I got more involved, started dating one of the girls in the group, and things seemed great. I thought I was getting closer to Christ, surrounded by people who cared about me. I even decided to get re-baptized at their upcoming retreat. After all, I'd been baptized at 8 and barely remembered it. The night before the retreat, we were told to attend a mandatory prayer meeting at the big church. I figured it was just so the congregation could meet us. When we got there, though, the room was mostly empty except for a few members and our leaders. Everyone was friendly enough. A little too nosy, but I was used to chatty church people. Then things got strange. During prayer, people started speaking in tongues. In my parents' church, that was considered rare, and when it did happen, someone was supposed to translate it for it to be of God. But here, it was chaos. The leader noticed how uncomfortable I was and pulled me aside to explain it as a special prayer language that came when you were deeply in tune with the Spirit. Then he asked if I wanted to pray to receive that gift. Not knowing how to respond and not wanting to back out right before my baptism, I agreed. He put his hand on the back of my head and started praying, quietly at first, then faster and louder, until his speech turned into clicks, whirs, and gibberish. After about 20 minutes, he suddenly switched back to English and told me to start praying. Freaked out but trying to fit in, I made up some nonsense syllables that sounded vaguely like Parseltongue from Harry Potter. I remember consciously deciding to fake it, and it worked. He started crying, hugged me, and said, "Welcome to the flock." I was unsettled, but I'd already paid for the retreat, so I pushed the weirdness aside. I went home, reflected on it, and convinced myself this must be normal and that I'd just misunderstood spirituality growing up. The next morning, I packed and headed out. The retreat felt mostly normal, just like our regular gatherings, but outdoors. Everyone acted as if nothing unusual had happened the night before. At about 5 p.m., we had baptisms at a nearby lake. There were 4 of us getting baptized, and it was your standard ceremony. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, followed by a dunk. After we dried off and ate dinner, there was a confirmation service that also seemed fine, until about 9 p.m. Once everything wrapped up, they brought out board games for anyone who wanted to play and opened a separate room for prayer. Slowly, people started disappearing into that room, one by one, until hardly anyone was left. Curious, I went in. The room was pitch black. Everyone was fully clothed, so nothing sexual was happening, but it was still surreal. People were dancing, shouting in tongues, laying hands on each other, claiming to heal illnesses. Some were prophesying about each other's futures. It was loud, chaotic, and unsettling. Somehow I got swept up in it and prophesied that 2 people would get married and have a child. Oddly enough, that actually happened later, so I guess I'm 1 for 1 in my prophecies. By about 3 a.m., everyone collapsed into bed. The next morning when I brought it up, everyone acted like nothing had happened. A few even claimed they didn't remember it at all. That's when I really started to feel uneasy. By the end of the semester, people were making plans to meet up during summer break. I dodged the invitations, saying I'd be busy visiting my girlfriend or working. They seemed to accept that, though they still called about once a week to invite me to Bible study. When I came back in the fall, things fell apart quickly. My girlfriend had cheated on me over the summer, and I was crushed. I went to the youth leader for support, but he was more upset that I'd slept with her than that I was hurting. He scolded me, told me to repent, and said I was on notice. For 3 weeks, I was treated like a sinner on probation. Then, one of my high school buddies invited me to his fraternity house for a Halo tournament and RC car races. It turned out to be a recruitment event, but everyone was welcoming and genuine, so I hung out. A few days later, they offered me a bid to join. I wasn't sure, so I asked the church leaders what they thought. They said fraternities were evil, that I'd be buying friends and doing the devil's work. That was my second and final strike. I pointed out the hypocrisy. There were sorority girls in the group and said, if you're going to be that hypocritical, I'd rather join the fraternity. At least they admit who they are. Then I walked out and never went back. They tried to convince my best friend, the one who'd introduced me to the group, to shun me, but he refused. He told them he'd work on converting me back, though he never actually tried. Years later, he was the best man at my wedding. Joining that fraternity was the best decision I ever made. Those guys saved me from that church. They let me find my own path and my own sense of spirituality, or maybe just peace on my terms. Story 12. I grew up in your typical non-denominational Christian household. Both of my parents were devout but not overbearing, at least not at first. That's why what happened next still stands out as one of the strangest turns my childhood ever took. One evening, my dad brought my older brother and me to a new church service at a place he'd heard about. Even at 7 years old, I thought it was odd that this church was being held in a dimly lit, single-story office complex. When we arrived, my father took us up to meet the pastor so he could pray over us. This man stood over my brother and me, laid his hands on our heads, and began speaking in tongues. I know some branches of Christianity practice that, but this was something else. As he spoke, the entire room joined in. Men and women raising their voices, some collapsing to the floor in what looked like seizure-like fits. When the pastor finished, he turned to my father and said that he had seen our futures through God's eyes. If we remained loyal, he claimed, we could achieve anything we wanted. Then his tone changed. He warned that now that we had been seen by God, the devil would use our toys to carry demons into our lives. That night, my dad threw away almost all of our toys. He told us he had seen a man's face turn lizard-like during the service and that we needed to rid ourselves of anything that might harbor evil spirits. The only thing that saved my brother and me from ever going back was my mother. When she heard what had happened, she was furious and forbade us from attending again. My parents eventually separated, but I believe my father continued to visit that church for years afterward. Today, he lives in a care facility, heavily medicated, distant, and dulled. I can't help but think about that night sometimes, and how easily a place claiming to serve God managed to twist faith into something so dark. Story 13. I worked for a cult. It was disguised as a private school for wealthy kids who struggled with addiction. On the surface, it looked like a therapeutic boarding school, a safe, structured place for recovery. In reality, it was something far darker. The place revolved around a charismatic leader who had an inner circle of young male students he openly favored and doted on. The school itself was abusive in subtle and not-so-subtle ways. None of us were properly trained, yet we were expected to handle serious medical responsibilities. I was administering medications within my first week, including PRN Thorazine, a heavy-duty antipsychotic. I had no medical license, no background in healthcare, just blind trust in a system that treated faith and obedience as qualifications. As staff, we were required to live under the same rules as the students. No freedom, no privacy, no outside influences. Before long, they began working to separate me from my family, telling me that I had an addiction I didn't, and that visiting my family on my time off was spiritually dangerous. They claimed I was dependent on my family, that I needed to heal my attachment to them. After a few weeks, I left. I told myself I just wasn't strong enough to handle the work, that I'd failed somehow. But something about the place haunted me, so I went back, determined to face whatever weakness I thought I had. That's when I finally saw it clearly for what it was. It wasn't me who was weak. It was the environment that was broken, manipulative, and cruel. By the time I left for good, I was not the same person. I developed a full-blown eating disorder, something I'd managed to avoid throughout my own adolescence, only to have it triggered by the control, shame, and deprivation that defined that place. The school eventually shut down after a string of lawsuits from parents who'd realized what was really happening behind closed doors. Many of the former students now have a Facebook group where they share their stories. From what I've read, most still struggle deeply with the trauma they endured, the systematic abuse disguised as treatment. The leader has since died. It later came out that all of his degrees and awards were fake. Every credential he'd ever boasted about was a lie. I took away hard lessons from that experience about trust, power, and the need for safety in programs meant to serve vulnerable people. But the scariest moment came one afternoon with a student who was actively psychotic. He should have been in a secure psychiatric facility, not in our care. He had stopped eating and was on a hunger strike, refusing to attend a group meeting. My supervisor ordered me to restrain him, even though he wasn't being violent. I was told to pick him up and carry him to the meeting, and then hold him there the entire time. I can still feel how wrong that was. The weight of him, the fear in his body, the silence in the room. It was the moment I finally understood this wasn't treatment, it was control, plain and simple. Story 14. For a short time, I attended what I'm pretty sure was a cult. On the surface, it called itself a non-denominational church. Friendly, modern, welcoming. But underneath, it was something else entirely. Behind the altar, there was a narrow hallway. One wall was lined with a low bookshelf packed with old Benny Hinn tapes. Halfway down that hall, a smaller corridor branched off, 2 bathrooms on the left and a small room on the right that they probably used for Bible study. One night, I was back there alone. The bathroom door was open, the light off, and the only bulb was one of those old pull-cord ones hanging from the ceiling. I swear, the light flickered on by itself. That moment still gives me chills. It was probably nothing, but at the time, it felt supernatural. I only went a few more times, but it was enough. People there told me I had demons living inside me, that I was being oppressed by them. It scared me so badly, I ended up seeking counseling from other ministers afterward, just to untangle the fear they planted. There was also relentless pressure to recruit new members. Every week, someone would claim to have had a dream or vision. Near the entrance, a chalkboard read, "Friends don't let friends go to hell," 3 exclamation marks included. One Sunday, a member stood up and described a dream where demons were attacking the whole town and the only safe place was our church. It didn't sound like faith anymore. It sounded like control. The biggest sin, according to them, was doubting their charismatic gifts, the speaking in tongues, the healings, the miracles. Even joking about it was considered blasphemy. If someone playfully tapped another on the head and said, "Be healed," they'd insist you'd just risked eternal damnation. That's seps when I realized what was really going on. Their version of faith wasn't built on love or trust. It was built on fear. Fear of questioning, fear of thinking, fear of being wrong. I stopped going soon after that. Looking back, I'm grateful I got out so quickly. What they called revelation was really just ignorance wearing a holy mask. Story 15. Back in college, I got involved with a Christian campus ministry during my freshman year. For a while, it felt like a good community, friendly people, lots of activities, and plenty of free pizza. By junior year, though, I realized my beliefs had changed. I considered myself agnostic and decided to leave the ministry. Things ended quietly, or so I thought. About 6 months later, I started dating this girl. 2 months into our relationship, she came over one day in tears. She told me that one of the staff members from that old ministry had sought her out. Apparently, they told her that I wasn't a good person, that I didn't respect women, and that she should be careful around me. The wild part? My girlfriend wasn't even involved in any church group. She was agnostic like me. So they must have found her through my social media, then just happened to run into her at a coffee shop. She was shaken, not because she believed them, but because of how invasive it all felt. It wasn't the first time they'd done something like that either. I'd heard stories of them tracking down people who'd left the group, trying to scare them back into compliance. Looking back, I realized that's not faith, that's control. And the best decision I ever made was walking away from that kind of mindset for good. Story 16. Anyone remember the family radio group from a few years back? Yeah, I left because I woke up on May 22nd. Then I started piecing my life back together. There wasn't a lot of creepy stuff that happened, but there was plenty that was deeply disturbing. When you're raising children to believe they were born only to die, that their entire purpose is to spread the message before the end of the world, everyone's in for a pretty messed up ride. I was 24, in a very fundamentalist church, even stricter than most. My first real clue came during a women's gathering. We were handing out snacks when a grown woman looked at the chips and said, "Oh no, my husband doesn't allow me to eat potato chips." Allow? Interesting. After that, the warning signs piled up fast. People scolded me for reading liberal magazines, which, by the way, was Reader's Digest. Later, I was quietly shunned for trying to lose weight with a diet drink mix. They told me I should be praying about it instead, that I just needed more faith. The final straw was the pastor Sip's wife. She told me she could tell exactly where I was in my walk with Jesus each day, by how much makeup I was wearing. That Sips when I knew it was time to go. Looking back, I realize how small my world had become. All fear, all judgment, no joy. Leaving was hard, but it was the best decision I ever made. I got my life back, one ordinary day at a time. Story 17. My grandfather was a French-Canadian Catholic. He had 2 brothers. One of them married a Jehovah's Witness and eventually converted. They took their faith very seriously. When my mom was young, this would have been in the late 1950s or early 60s, they once chewed her out for sending a Christmas card. Despite that, my grandfather kept in touch. They were family. After all, even after my mom's side moved to the United States, he still visited his brother's farm up in Canada whenever he could. That's Sips where it happened. One day there was a terrible farming accident. My grandfather rushed his brother to the nearest hospital. The doctor said he needed an amputation and a blood transfusion. His brother was unconscious. His wife and kids were in town, long before cell phones, so the decision fell to my grandfather. Without hesitation, he told them to go ahead. His brother survived, but that choice cost him the relationship. Afterward, that entire branch of the family cut off contact. They never forgave him for authorizing the transfusion, something their beliefs forbid. As far as anyone knows, they never reconciled. It's one of those family stories that lingers, tragic not because of malice, but because of conviction. A brother saved a life, but in doing so, lost a family. Story 18. I was raised as one of Jehovah's Witnesses. They're not a cult in the Jonestown sense of the word, but they're far more controlling than most churches. Jehovah's Witnesses are convinced that theirs is the one true faith. Members literally call it the truth. They believe the end of the world is just around the corner and that everyone outside the religion lives under Satan's influence. That mindset creates an us versus them world where witnesses see themselves as the only good people trying to rescue a few others before the end comes. I eventually left because the doctrines just didn't make sense to me. There wasn't one dramatic breaking point, more like 1,000 small realizations that something wasn't right. Inside the organization, there's a kind of internal judicial system. If you break the rules, things like premarital sex, smoking, accepting a blood transfusion, you're investigated by a group of elders. They decide whether you should be disfellowshipped, which means everyone you know and love is required to shun you. Divorce is another example. You're not allowed to remarry unless your spouse dies or commits adultery. So when a marriage ends, it becomes a silent standoff. Whoever moves on first gets shunned, and only then is the other person free to marry again. The list of potential sins is long: sexual misconduct of any kind, celebrating holidays, voting, smoking, or using drugs. Even small things, swearing, watching R-rated movies, are considered wrong. Members are expected to fill most of their time reading church literature, attending meetings several nights a week, and going door to door. Growing up in that world often means being completely sheltered. Many witness kids are homeschooled and rarely interact with outsiders. Even those who attend public school can't stand for the national anthem, celebrate birthdays, join sports teams, or participate in holiday events. Friendships outside the faith are discouraged, so you grow up in a tiny bubble that revolves entirely around the organization. I know plenty of people who've lived that way their whole lives, part-time jobs and constant preaching, convinced the end is any day now. Leaving was the hardest and best thing I ever did. Once you step outside that bubble, you realize how big the world really is. Story 19. I grew up Southern Baptist. Definitely not a cult, but I've been to a few churches that came close to doing some cultish things. Take Bible camp, for example. One year, they showed us a documentary claiming that Satan could more easily take hold of people who listen to secular music. According to the film, those songs made you more likely to end up in hell. When it ended, they built a huge bonfire and encouraged all of us kids to throw our secular CDs into it. Watching everyone toss their music in, some crying, some cheering, was surreal. Then there was the Sunday. They brought a little boy up front who needed a heart transplant. The pastor had a fancy bottle of olive oil and poured it all over the poor kid's head. The elders gathered around, laid hands on him, and smeared the oil across his forehead while praying loudly. I was about 14, standing there frozen, thinking, oh geez, is this a cult? Pretty sure this is something a cult would do. Looking back, it wasn't malicious, just intense. But that was the day I realized that even well-meaning churches can sometimes cross a line between faith and fear. Story 20. This is probably too late to get noticed, but whatever. I used to attend a very small Catholic school, maybe 100 students, K through 12. I say Catholic in quotes because the church itself wouldn't recognize it. Apparently the man who ran it was considered a bit of a loose cannon, and, well, they were right. Officially, it was a school that taught Catholic theology. In reality, it was closer to a cult. We even had visiting prophets, friends of the principal, who'd share their visions with us. When the swine flu outbreak happened, one of them announced that it would kill a third of the world's population. Fear was basically part of the curriculum. Science and common sense didn't stand a chance. In theology debates, the outcome was always predetermined. The approved side always won. It wasn't instead education, it was indoctrination. They also made us do some pretty disturbing things. One year, when I was a junior, my class had to lead a retreat for the freshmen and sophomores. Our job? Convince them that dating, or even kissing, made them immoral. Standing up there, parroting that message, felt awful. Then, there were the protests. We were sent downtown to stand outside Planned Parenthood holding graphic anti-abortion signs. Even as a naive, pro-life teenager, I knew it was wrong. I remember feeling ashamed but powerless, because saying no wasn't really an option. Eventually, the whole place unraveled. The principal seemed to fixate on me for reasons I still don't understand. It became his personal mission to make my life miserable, pulling me out of class, accusing me of disobedience, isolating me from friends. It reached a point where I dreaded walking through the doors every morning. Looking back now, it's obvious the school wasn't about faith, it was about control. Fear disguised as holiness, obedience dressed up as virtue. Leaving that environment was the best decision I ever made. Story 21. I was raised in a cult, though I didn't realize that's what it was at the time. Leaving wasn't my choice. My parents made that decision when I was about 13. I was never physically abused, but I have a sibling who still struggles deeply because of what we lived through. Somehow I came out mostly okay. The craziest thing I ever saw happened when I was about 12. A girl my age, who I later learned had her own troubles, was asked to perform an exorcism on a 60-year-old man. As everyone prayed, he began shaking, vomiting on the floor, and pretending to speak a dead language. I just remember watching, terrified, not understanding what was real anymore. The group itself started small, maybe 10 families who met twice a week at a house in our suburban neighborhood. The leader was a former military man who called himself a prophet. Originally, it was just a Bible study, but over time it evolved into something much darker. They taught that regular Christians weren't truly saved, only we were. Soon everyone began homeschooling their kids to protect us from corruption, especially the teaching of evolution. We lived in a bubble. Anything could supposedly harbor demons. Once my parents destroyed some decorative fan poles because they believed evil spirits lived in them. They told us to hold our breath while they smashed them, as if that would stop the demons from entering us. Eventually, they decided that every bad thought or action was caused by demonic possession. That sips when the exorcisms began. At first, they looked like group prayers, but they turned into hour-long ordeals filled with shouting, crying, and people speaking as if they were the demon. Sometimes, people had to be held down. They performed several of these on me, and when I didn't react the way they expected, they said the demons had too tight a grip on me. One woman finally left after being accused of having the spirit of Jezebel. That was her breaking point. The teachings grew even stranger. The leader became obsessed with his personal interpretation of the apocalypse, that true believers would live through God's wrath instead of being saved from it. He claimed the end was coming within a couple of years, and anyone who didn't act like it lacked faith. Families emptied savings accounts and sold belongings to prove their devotion. His daughter, my age at the time, began claiming she could see angels and demons. During meetings, she'd describe what the angels were doing and quote their messages. Her mother backed her up. People treated them like oracles, even asking the angels questions through her. When someone dared ask in Spanish, a language the girl didn't know, he was scolded for lacking faith and made to apologize. Eventually, we all stayed up one night, convinced the apocalypse was happening. We prayed, chanted, waited. Morning came, nothing. That was the moment a few families began to realize the truth. After the group collapsed, our family was left in poverty because of all the reckless financial choices made to show faith. My mother still keeps in touch with the leader's family, who now live quietly on a farm with many children. I know dozens of people from those years who never fully recovered. For me, the memories come in fragments: fear, confusion, and a sense of lost time. But I also learned something: belief can be powerful, and when it's twisted by control and fear, it can destroy lives. That's what I took with me when we finally left, the determination never to let someone else tell me what to believe again. Story 22. My cousin is still involved in Scientology. She's part of the group's Sea Org and has been working as a secretary there for more than 7 years. She sips in her early 20s now. Her mother, my aunt, can't call or write to her freely. Any letters or messages she sends are intercepted and reviewed for how they might affect her focus on the greater good. Once in a while, my aunt will manage to reach her by phone, just long enough to say, "I love you." Then the line goes silent. My cousin's father has been involved with Scientology since the early days. My mom remembers the day he joined back in California. He was walking down the street when a car pulled up beside him. A woman got out and asked, "Do you have any real friends? Are you truly happy?" She handed him a pamphlet and invited him to a meeting. He went that same day and never really came back from it. He was audited to determine his spiritual level, and from there, he dove in completely. Some of his beliefs grew stranger over time. Once, while he and my mom were working together, she accidentally cut her hand. He told her to go back and try cutting herself again, because according to him, no two identical events can happen in this world. That moment terrified her. He also talked about how members sometimes punished those who left. He claimed they would find out where a former member worked and call non-stop from different numbers or file complaints until the person quit. He said it proudly, as if it proved loyalty. His views about life and family changed too. He believed that having children was a kind of spiritual mistake, that bringing new life into the world allowed evil spirits to enter. According to him, that's why some followers chose adoption or joined only after becoming parents. The irony, of course, is that he had children of his own after converting. It's heartbreaking. My cousin grew up inside that system and doesn't seem to know anything else. I hope one day she finds a way out, or at least a way back to the people who still love her. Story 23. I was part of a program that, in my view, operated very much like a cult. It found me when I was at one of the lowest points in my life. The group had a detailed system of levels, stages of mastery you were meant to climb through. Early on, the lessons focused on breaking down your sense of independence. You were told you were powerless, that control over your life had to be handed to a higher power. It was worded broadly enough to attract people of any faith or none, but the underlying message was clear: surrender yourself to the system. Each of us was assigned a sponsor, someone who had supposedly completed all the stages. We were told to contact that person whenever we had doubts. Their job was to keep us loyal, to reassure us that we were getting better, that questioning meant we were in denial. Eventually, I began researching the movement's history. Its founder, according to historical accounts, struggled with addiction during Prohibition and experienced intense religious visions after years of substance abuse. Psychiatrists of his time reportedly described him as suffering from serious mental illness. Despite that, his ideas became the foundation for a program that's still promoted as the gold standard for recovery. Many of its principles conflict with modern psychology and neuroscience. Yet, within the community, if you raise scientific or philosophical objections, you're often told that doubt proves you're still sick. It's a clever trap. Disagreement becomes evidence of the very condition they claim to cure. One of the most troubling aspects to me is that even when someone rebuilds their life and stays healthy for years, they're still considered in recovery. They're told the illness never truly ends, and that leaving the meetings is dangerous. The message is that independence equals relapse. There's also a legal dimension. In some places, people convicted of certain offenses are required by courts to attend 12-step meetings as a condition of probation. That blurs the line between voluntary religion-based support and mandated treatment. What disturbs me most is how society often celebrates these programs without question. Their underlying philosophy that people are powerless and must rely on a higher power may help some, but it can also discourage self-efficacy and personal accountability. To be clear, this is my experience and my perspective. I know many people who say the 12-step approach saved their lives, and I don't doubt that it can be positive for them. But I also believe it's important to recognize that the model isn't universal, that there are secular and evidence-based alternatives that deserve attention. In the end, what I learned is this: any organization that tells you you're helpless without it, that you can never be whole on your own, deserves to be questioned. Story 24. I spent 4 years in what I can only describe as a treatment cult, an outpatient recovery center run by a mother and daughter therapy team. On paper, it was supposed to help people struggling with addiction or mental health issues. In practice, it became a closed system that revolved around control. Once clients were considered better, they were offered jobs inside the system, as counselors, office staff, or landlords renting rooms to new arrivals. 2 senior members even owned outside businesses, one in landscaping, the other in elderly companion care, that primarily employed clients. It kept everyone financially and socially tied to the program. The entire model was built around the 12 steps. Everyone was required to attend the same 6:30 a.m. meeting, whether or not alcohol was their issue. About 95% of the attendees were clients from the center. You had to have a sponsor, ideally another client, so the staff could monitor you more closely. We were expected to call our sponsor and at least 3 support people every day to report how we were doing. For me, those calls were awkward summaries of my day. I've never been great at discussing emotions. New clients attended 3 group sessions a week. Those groups were called conflict resolution meetings, but they were mostly public shaming. If you broke any rule, and the rules changed constantly, you'd be humiliated in front of 20 to 30 people. You were told you'd relapse or destroy your life if you didn't comply. Every client also had one weekly individual session, but whatever you said there could be repeated in group later. I later learned that several formal complaints were filed with the state over these privacy violations. When my grandfather died, I was already in trouble for missing my daily calls. The therapists made me phone my parents and tell them that if someone from the program didn't accompany me to the funeral, they would forbid me from going. My parents, initially skeptical of the place, ended up paying for a staff member to fly with me. I didn't tell them I'd been coerced into that until much later. Two friends of mine began secretly dating. Relationships were strictly controlled. When the therapists found out, they gave them a choice: break up or leave. They left, even though one of them had been there since childhood, because his parents were longtime members. Eventually, I decided to leave. I was renting an apartment owned by another client and working for the landscaping business. My roommates were newer clients who were away for the weekend at a mandatory intensive retreat. I told staff I'd join them later, pretending I was going to a meeting first. At the meeting location, I excused myself to use the bathroom and walked out. I turned off my phone, drove to a theater, and watched a movie just to clear my head. When I finally went home around 1 a.m., I sat in the dark trying to figure out what to do next. Then came the knocking. Two police officers, my primary therapist, and another client were at the door. They said the therapist had told police I might harm myself. They gave me a choice: return to the program or be held for a 72-hour psychiatric evaluation. I went back. Once there, I was treated like a brand new member, stripped of privileges, watched constantly, made to earn trust again. Months later, I got a normal job. When one of my roommates was expelled from the program, I let him keep living with me. That set off another round of harassment, both from staff and other clients, so I simply stopped showing up to groups and meetings. My therapist then called my mother, claiming I was suicidal and urging an intervention. My mom, by then aware of their tactics, thanked her and hung up. After that, every friend who remained in the program was told not to speak to me. That's how they kept control, by cutting people off from anyone who left. I was lucky. A few others, who'd recently escaped, stayed in touch, and we helped each other rebuild. Still, the isolation hit hard, and I fell into depression for months. Over time, I discovered a long discussion thread online, former clients sharing horror stories about the same center. Eventually, the lead therapist passed away, and many senior members left. A new male therapist was hired, and I later heard allegations that he'd had an inappropriate relationship with a newly recovering client. That was years ago now. I've rebuilt my life and found legitimate therapy that focuses on empowerment rather than obedience. Looking back, I realize how easily vulnerability can be exploited, especially when people are desperate to heal. If a program demands total surrender of your privacy, your time, and your independence, it's not treatment. It's steps control. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.